Hi guys, Vaadin 10 is out. Naturally, Vaadin-on-Kotlin does support it natively. So it's quite a major release for Vaadin guys. So maybe I should take this opportunity to introduce what Vaadin-on-Kotlin is, how it precisely works, and how it can help you. So, but first, what is Vaadin? So, Vaadin is a web or component-oriented framework, a web framework. So, in this regard, it is really very different to those Kotlin components that have been created as of late. For example, Ktor, because Ktor is simply a REST endpoint, REST server endpoint configurator. So it actually just creates REST endpoints. On the other hand, Vaadin is actually a means to control your web applications from server side. Okay, so this video is going to have two parts. First part is going to cover the client side or the UI side, Vaadin 10 side of the Vaadin-on-Kotlin framework. Part 2 will cover the database access. We are going to start with this Caribou 10 Hello World application. So it's free and open source on GitHub, so you can just clone it and open it directly. So just git clone, then you can build it with Gradle and run it directly from Gradle as a quick start. This will actually run a Greti plugin which will run the application in Jetty, since this is a really standard war Java application, nothing more. Okay, so so Vaadin basically is a component-oriented framework. Every component in Vaadin has three parts. So it's a server-side, standard Java classes, then accompanied by a client-side written in JavaScript. Well, actually, in Vaadin 8, the client side is usually written in Java and then compiled through Git into JavaScript. However, this has been changed radically in Vaadin 10, since Vaadin 10 actually takes advantage of the newly formed standard of web components. So in the client side, there are just plain web components, and the role of connector is actually taken by so-called Vaadin Flow. So Vaadin Flow, what Vaadin Flow does is that it's responsible for synchronizing the state of a client-side web component and server-side component. So it is responsible to transfer all properties, all state to the client, and all events to the server side. So in the server side we have a servlet, so nothing special about that. Then we have a view, which is kind of a page populated by components or elements. So it's an H1 element and button, and so on and so on. On the client side, we have a list of web components installed by the means of Power. So we are using Polymer and Vaadin Core or Vaadin Elements on the client side. Okay, without further ado, we could actually launch the project in through Gradle, but it's not as handy for development as when running it via IDE. I'm going to use IntelliJ Ultimate, and I'll run it in Tomcat. So what we just need to do is we need to add a launch configuration, a local one, named Tomcat, and we will just need to mark this war exploded artifact for deployment, and that's it. So now we have this Tomcat launch configuration. We can just simply launch it and see how the application looks as of now. Okay, so here's the H1, the button, which basically changes the text, and yeah, so a bunch of components. Okay, so let's do a brief introduction into the component. So to add Vaadin is a component writing framework. So we modify the page by adding components. So we will add a button with the caption of click me, and when it is clicked, it will change the caption or text. So thanks, clicked. Okay, so we are going to redeploy the war application inside of Tomcat. And now when we refresh, we will have the button itself. So yeah, the interesting bit is that this is actually a Vaadin button. So it is a web element called Vaadin button, a proper web element with shadow root and everything. So how did this got rendered? So basically on the server side, a component graph was constructed, so a vertical layout, so everything is nested in a vertical layout, which is a H1 and a button. Now this button this is just a DSL wrapper for this button, so it's a Vaadin button, which extends this guy, and here things get interesting. So this is kind of a configuration for Vaadin flow, which when this tag is used, then the Vaadin flow will know that on the client side it needs to instantiate or create an element called Vaadin button, which will then talk with this wrapper or server side image or whatever it is called. So so when we create this component, it gets transmitted via Vaadin flow to client side, and it will add this element client side. When the button is clicked, a polymer event is fired, which is captured by Vaadin flow and transmitted to server side by the means of this click listener. So every button has a registration point for adding click listeners, which gets notified when a button is clicked. Okay, so pretty basic stuff. So let's add a text field into the mix. So make a text field. Okay, placeholder, please enter your name. And actually, Vaadin flow has a bug which won't update the value property of the text field server side until there is a value change listener. So I'm going to just add an empty value change listener. Hopefully the guys will fix this for us. So and when clicked, the button will actually add a new div or label, which will list the name. So thanks, name, value, it works. So when the button is clicked, the value of the text field is also transmitted by flow to server side, and we can read it and direct Vaadin to create a label component, which gets then transmitted by flow to the client side, and the label component is created. So actually, this is again just a wrapper for a label, so it should create a label element. So when we redeploy the application and refresh, then there should be this guy. So it's a Vaadin text field, web component, click me, and okay, it should create label element just as directed. Okay, cool. Okay, so now to make things interesting, we are going to create a custom web component and register it to Vaadin. So in here we have a really simple module with an example template, which has one property called value, which we are going to set from the server side. It is going to be an example template element, Polymer element or web component or whatever, and we are going to connect to that client-side component by means of this class. So an example template extends Polymer template. When instantiated, use this tag, and when instantiated, import this HTML file so that the component is registered in a browser. To actually set the value of the value property, we need to use this example model or template model, which tells Flow to transfer that value to client side. So, and to change the value, you just need to call a set value on a model. So instead of adding a label, we'll add the template in here. So example template. So we have this DSL function in here, which will allow us to create and insert the template into the component tree in this DSL manner. So set value initial value, and when the button is clicked, then we will just set the value of thanks, name value. Okay, so when the button is clicked, then the value of this text field is transferred server side, and then after the click listener terminates, the new state is transferred client side. So the template is set the new value, thanks something, and this call tells Flow to update the value or the value property to given value, which is then updated in here. So so let's look. Okay, so we have an example template DOM element which contains a shadow road, and inside of that there is this span with given value. So this is really awesome because you can really easily integrate Vaadin with any of those thousands already pre-made components, Polymer components or web components in general, Google Maps, I don't know, all those paper elements, so whatever you like. So by just simply introducing a class like this in your application, and of course telling Bower to include the element itself into the Bower components directory. Okay, that's it. That's a brief introduction to Vaadin 10. So for more information, please head towards the vaadin.com/flow or Vaadin 10 web page. So this was the UI part of the Vaadin-on-Kotlin framework, and now for the second part, the database access.